Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Harris County Flood Control District's virtual community engagement meeting to discuss the Red Bluff Detention Basin Optimization Project. This virtual community meeting is being offered by the Flood Control District to share vital information with the community and to gather your input on flood risk reduction efforts in your area. Community engagement is a critical component of our work, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening. My name is Robert Fricke with the Flood Control District Communications team. I am joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we continue to keep you up to date on important flood mitigation efforts. We are glad to see the community engaged with this project and look forward to gathering your feedback tonight. Moving forward, we will continue to share updates on this and other projects in your area to keep you involved and informed. First, we would like to begin tonight's meeting with remarks from Harris County Precinct 2 Commissioner Adrian Garcia.
And good evening, everyone. I'm Adrian Garcia, Harris County Precinct 2 Commissioner. Thank you to the Flood Control District for hosting this event. Before we begin, I want to send a sincere thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I know we are still working through the impacts of the pandemic and now facing some challenges with the economy. High gas prices, inflation, and public safety continues to be on the top of the mind of all of us, especially me. I want you to know that we're in this together, and my team and I are working hard every day to address these issues, especially public safety. Our efforts are already showing positive results, but we're not going to let up just yet. Tonight, we're here to listen about a project that will reduce flooding in your community. We know this is always top of mind for families who have been repeatedly impacted by the flooding in their communities. As a part of my new Revive to Thrive initiative, this flood prevention effort will help protect the community and make a major step toward ensuring there are fair and equitable opportunities for communities throughout Precinct 2. With Revive to Thrive, our goal is to focus on revitalization rather than gentrification by empowering communities and creating opportunities for our existing neighborhoods to be resilient, inclusive, and thriving. With the right investments, resources, infrastructure, commitment, and community involvement like tonight, we can all progress and thrive. Harris County works best when all communities thrive. I'm proud to be from Precinct 2, and I want everyone to know this community is a great place to live, work, and play. This is one of the many flood mitigation projects happening in Precinct 2 aimed at improving our drainage systems to help minimize the impact of major rain events, keeping you, your family, your property, and your community safe. We know that residents in this community experience flooding during major rain events, including Tropical Storm Allison and, of course, record levels during Hurricane Harvey. This project is intended to help prevent a repeat of those events. Quality infrastructure is not only my responsibility as a county commissioner, but it is one of my major priorities. This is why I've asked my team with taking action and demonstrating real progress to address our community's needs. Things that make a difference and make us better prepared to weather the next storm. I hope you continue to stay engaged in this process. It's important to remember that your voice, your experiences, and your opinions do matter. Again, we're thankful that you've joined us tonight. If you need to get in touch with my office, please visit our website at hcp2.com or call us at 713-274-2222 or follow us on social media. We are on every major platform. Our doors are always open. My team and I are happy to support in whatever we can. Again, this is County Commissioner Adrian Garcia thanking you for taking time out tonight. Have a great meeting.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. We appreciate you sharing your remarks. This virtual public meeting will begin with a presentation to share project updates, including an overview of the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin Optimization Project, timelines, and next steps. The presentation will be followed by a virtual question and answer session with Flood Control District team members, where we'll respond to your questions and comment on some of the frequently asked questions we receive from the public. Attendees will be able to submit comments and questions through the website or by phone. Any comments not addressed during the Q&A session will receive a response from the Flood Control District after the close of the comment period. Instructions on how to participate in the virtual meeting are included on this slide. on this virtual meeting webpage and on the Flood Control District's website. I will also share a reminder of these instructions when we reach the Q&A portion of the meeting. We will now transition to Gary Besmick, Planning Division Manager with the Flood Control District, who will share information about the Flood Control District and this project. Gary, over to you.
Thank you, Robert, and a special thanks to each of you for joining us. In this presentation, we will give a brief overview of this project. Before we get to the project specifics, we want to share a bit of background about the Flood Control District. The Harris County Flood Control District is a special purpose district created by the Texas legislature in 1937 in response to devastating floods that hit the Houston area in 1929 and 1935. The Flood Control District is governed by the Harris County Commissioners Court and works closely with other entities in our region, such as the Harris County Engineering Department and the City of Houston. The organization was created in part to serve as a local partner to leverage federal funding for flood damage reduction projects. Our mission has expanded since our founding, leading to billions of dollars in federal, state, and locally funded infrastructure improvements in the ground. The mission of the Harris County Flood Control District is to provide flood damage reduction projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. One of the most difficult challenges we face is constructing effective projects that are sensitive to community and natural values in a highly urbanized area. Harris County includes 23 main watersheds, totaling approximately 1,800 square miles and more than 2,500 linear miles of channel. 2,500 miles is approximately the distance from New York to California. A watershed is a geographical region of land that drains to a common channel or outlet. Each watershed has its own unique characteristics and needs. The project we are presenting tonight is in the Armandbody watershed that is located in southeast Harris County. Harris County and our surrounding area is flood prone for a number of reasons. Namely, we experience extreme rainfall events, including tropical storms and hurricanes. Our area is largely made up of flat, slow draining land. And we see large concentrations of clay soils that do not soak up excess rainfall quickly. While the Flood Control District plays a critical role in flood risk reduction, we are one of several entities involved in these efforts in our region. When rain falls on your roof, it flows through several jurisdictions, such as streets and drains managed by the Harris County Engineering Department, a municipal utility district, or a city, such as the City of Houston, before it flows into a larger channel, creek, or bayou that the Flood Control District owns and maintains. This slide illustrates the various jurisdictions, which sometimes we even share with other entities. Inside neighborhoods, as shown on the left side of this illustration, storm sewers and roadside ditches collect stormwater runoff and start the process of moving it away from homes and streets. Storm sewers and roadside ditches are the responsibility of the underlying municipality. The larger bayous and channels that take the collected stormwater and move it through our drainage system to Galveston Bay are the responsibility of the Flood Control District. This is shown on the right side of the illustration. In the middle is a stormwater detention basin, sometimes constructed by the Flood Control District. When storm sewers on the left are increased, this creates an increase in runoff. Since it is our policy to avoid any adverse impacts from our projects, detention basins help to safely take in and temporarily store excess stormwater during heavy rain events. Often, we partner with Harris County precincts, utility districts, and others to add recreational amenities such as trails to these basins and along our channels. On August 25th, 2018, Harris County voters approved $2.5 billion in bonds for flood risk reduction projects. This vote followed a series of 23 meetings with community members across Harris County, one per watershed, which resulted in a list of what is now 181 bond projects. As of August 25th, 2021, every project included in the 2018 bond program has been initiated, including the 8 projects in the Armandbody watershed. A total of more than $1.35 billion in partnership funding has been secured so far to stretch the 2018 bond program even farther. The actual timing of each individual project will depend on a variety of factors, including environmental permitting, right-of-way acquisition, and utility relocation, and in some cases, the requirements of a particular grant. Project lists and projected schedules are updated regularly on our website. While the bond was for $2.5 billion, the full cost of every project in the bond tables is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects in the bond program. As I've mentioned, we've had some success so far, having secured more than $1.35 billion in partner funds for projects across Harris County. And this graphic illustrates the many sources of those partnerships, including federal, state, and local funding that Flood Control District is working to secure for Harris County. Each agency has its own definition of eligible projects and its own requirements for local match funding. So the Flood Control District works diligently to match projects to the right partnership opportunities. We will now move into the part of the program that is specifically about the Armandbody watershed and the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin Optimization Project. As a reminder, we are looking for your input as we discuss the project in more detail. Please feel free to drop any questions or comments into the comment box or to comment via phone by pushing the star key. The Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin Optimization Project is in the Armandbody watershed. The map on the screen shows Harris County limits with the watershed identified in gray and the project location in pink. We will show you a close-up of the project area a little later. This project was identified by the Armandbody Watershed Planning Study that was completed in 2021. This project involves the optimization of an existing stormwater detention basin in the Armandbody watershed, the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin, formally identified as HCFCD Unit B500-04-00, in conjunction with potential channel modifications to tributary B115-00-00. The project will examine ways to make the most effective use of the basin in connection with future stormwater conveyance improvements to reduce flood risks in the area. At this point in the project, both components will be examined, but only the detention basin will move forward immediately to design. Here is a closer look at the Armandbody watershed. As mentioned, this project was identified by the Armandbody Watershed Planning Study completed in 2021. The Armandbody Watershed Planning Study investigated flooding problems, identified ongoing and proposed flood mitigation projects, and evaluated and recommended potential projects to reduce flooding risks in the watershed. Taking a watershed-wide approach to planning ensures that future flood risk reduction projects work together and are sequenced appropriately to achieve the maximum benefits. Planners worked with Harris County, municipalities, including the cities of Pasadena, Deer Park, LaPorte, and Houston, and other agencies, both to clarify flooding issues in the watershed and to improve coordination between flood control district regional projects and future local projects. The Armandbody Watershed Planning Study was funded by Harris County, the Texas General Land Office of the State of Texas, and the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development through the Community Development Block Grant Program. Here you see a floodplain map of Armandbody watershed with the floodway in dark blue, the 1% or 100-year floodplain in light blue, and the 0.2% or 500-year floodplain in green. The Armandbody Watershed Planning Study identified and evaluated 39 locations with significant drainage or flooding problems. The primary sources for flooding of structures in the watershed include a combination of local storm sewer network limitations, limited channel stormwater conveyance capacity, and off-site flow from adjacent subareas. The study identified 3 major problem areas in the watershed. These include portions of the following subwatersheds: Horsepen Bayou, or B104-00-00, Willow Spring Creek, otherwise known as B112-00-00, and finally tributaries B114-00-00 and B115-00-00, with associated areas of the Armandbody main stem, which we classify as B100-00-00. Once existing and potential future problems were identified across the watershed, the study team refined conceptual solutions for top-tier problem areas to select projects for prioritization. The most promising project recommended for the Armandbody watershed focuses on improvements to tributary B115 and surrounding areas, which is what we are here to discuss today. The project includes 2 components: channel modifications to tributary B115 to improve stormwater conveyance, and increase stormwater detention to prevent downstream impacts. Again, we will show this in more detail shortly. Before we do, I'd like to pause and take a moment to provide an overview on these 2 flood mitigation tools. Channel modifications have long been used by the Flood Control District and other entities to reduce the risk of flooding by improving the ability of the channel to move stormwater out of an area. This can be accomplished by widening, deepening, and/or straightening the channel, or by lining the channel with various materials. Maintenance projects to remove woody vegetation or accumulated sediment can also restore the channel's ability to convey stormwater. Channel conveyance improvement projects often require additional stormwater detention in the form of a stormwater detention basin to reduce flood risks. Stormwater detention basins provide storage for runoff of floodwaters. This storage is temporarily held and prevents stormwater from overwhelming channels. While channel conveyance improvements move stormwater more efficiently out of an area, strategically located stormwater detention basins temporarily store the stormwater to ensure that the project does not transfer the flooding risk to downstream communities. When channel stormwater levels drop back down, the stored stormwater drains back into the channel by gravity via outfall pipes appropriately sized to drain the basin. This is important because, as mentioned before, the Flood Control District is a no adverse impact agency, which means we don't allow our projects to reduce flooding risks for one area by increasing them for another. Typically, stormwater detention is constructed first and can provide flood risk reduction benefits on its own. This is the case for the Red Bluff project. This brings us to where we are today. The visual on this slide shows the typical project lifecycle of a flood risk reduction project. While every flood risk reduction project is unique, they all have a common life cycle. Each project begins and ends with predictable milestones along the way. In the case of this project, the Armandbody Watershed Planning Study we just discussed served as the feasibility stage. If you would like to review the Watershed Planning Study, you can visit the Armandbody section of our website at www.hcfcd.org/Armand. A list of links to projects in the Armandbody watershed runs down the left side of the webpage. You will see that other projects recommended by the planning study are separately underway in the watershed. The Red Bluff project is now in the early preliminary engineering stage of its project lifecycle, as indicated by the arrow on the screen. Preliminary engineering is an important stage in the development of a project in which we conduct a detailed evaluation of the site. During this stage, flood control district engineers and environmental specialists develop and evaluate possible alternatives for the identified project to meet flood damage reduction goals. Ultimately, one alternative is recommended at the conclusion of this project stage in a document called the Preliminary Engineering Report, or PER for short. Performance metrics will be used to determine the recommended alternative along with community input. We will look for the alternative that is the most feasible and cost-effective to construct while minimizing environmental impacts and maximizing flood risk reduction benefits. Here is a closer look at the Red Bluff project area. This project is located in the city of Pasadena near Red Bluff Road and Spencer Highway. The project seeks to address the limited channel stormwater conveyance capacity for tributary B500-04-00-E004 and portions of Armand Bayou, which are primary causes for flooding in this area. Due to the large amount of historic flooding in this watershed, the Flood Control District and other stormwater management jurisdictions have constructed multiple stormwater detention facilities throughout the watershed, several of which are in this project area and identified on this map. For this project, we will be analyzing options for optimizing the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin, which is outlined in pink and located near where tributary B500-04-00-E004 meets Armand Bayou. With limited options for new detention in this project area, basin optimization is the preferred, most cost-effective choice. Now that we are familiar with the project area, let's dig into details on the two key project components. The first step in the preliminary engineering stage for this project is to identify potential channel modifications to tributary B500-04-00-E004. Our goal for this project stage is to analyze options for expanding channel stormwater carrying capacity within existing flood control district right-of-way while minimizing community disruption. We will also learn what limitations we might have under federal environmental regulations regarding impacts to tributary B500-04-00-E004, which is a man-made channel, and Armandbody, which is a natural channel. Based on the options identified for channel modifications, we will then look at ways to optimize the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin to prevent downstream impacts, which is component 2 of the project. The Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin pictured here was built in the early 2000s by the Flood Control District. In this photograph looking northwest, you can see Line Drive in the foreground. During rain events, this basin takes in and temporarily stores floodwater from Armand Bayou. This is a dry bottom basin, and due to its proximity to Ellington Airfield, it must remain as such to minimize the potential for wildlife hazards. This basin is divided by an easement set aside for a possible future extension of Olson Lane. This easement runs roughly east-west through the middle of the basin. Two separate compartments of the basin function together due to openings across this easement. The identified channel conveyance improvements will help inform how much additional stormwater storage capacity will be needed. Alternatives to be investigated may include expanding the detention basin within existing flood control district-owned property and rights-of-way to the maximum extent possible, deepening all compartments of the basin while maintaining dry bottom stormwater detention, and possibly acquiring property to expand the basin footprint if necessary. Together, channel modifications and increased stormwater detention will result in the most flood risk benefit to the drainage area with no downstream impacts. However, the basin optimization will have flood risk reduction benefits of its own, and it must be completed before any channel modifications can take place. The next steps for the Red Bluff project as part of the preliminary engineering stage include developing and evaluating possible alternatives, determining potential utility relocations or property acquisitions, developing cost estimates for design and construction, and preparing the final preliminary engineering report. The anticipated completion date of the preliminary engineering stage is the summer of 2023. While alternatives for both channel modifications and stormwater detention optimization will be identified during the preliminary engineering stage, the optimization of the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin will be the first component to proceed to the next stage in the project lifecycle, which is design and potential property acquisition. An additional note, you may also be hearing about a separate Red Bluff Road drainage improvement project led by the city of Pasadena. That is a project to improve road drainage on Red Bluff Road between Lance Avenue and Line Drive. It is one of our partnership projects with Pasadena, partially funded by the 2018 bond program. I will now turn the program back over to Robert to kick off the question and answer.
Thanks, Gary. Before we move into the Q&A, I want to share a quick reminder that we're looking for your input. We'd love to hear from you on this and other projects moving forward across Harris County. Your input is critical as we continue to develop project plans for this and other flood risk reduction efforts. All comments and questions received this evening will be considered as we develop plans for this effort, but the conversation doesn't end here. To learn more about this project and ask questions and sign up for our mailing list, please visit hcfcd.org/redbluff. As a reminder, there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. Submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. Submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/redbluff, or submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 4679. If you are joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. Additionally, I want to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. Information from this meeting and a recording of the live stream will be available on the Flood Control District's website and YouTube channel. Joining Gary for our Q&A session tonight is Jonathan St. Romain, Department Manager for Capital Projects South. Now it's time to take some of your questions. All right, our first question for this evening is for Jonathan. Jonathan, what do you mean by a dry bottom basin? And which is better against flooding, a wet bottom basin or dry?
Sure, that's a good question that we do get a lot. So a dry bottom basin is designed to, of course, drain dry after a storm event and remain dry between rain events, rather than maintaining a permanent pool of water. In a wet bottom basin, the water surface, the permanent pool of water, what we would call the water surface, would be 8 or 10 or 12 feet below ground level, and that acts as the bottom of the basin. And the storage area of the basin is all of that area above that permanent pool of water that's, like I said, would be about 8 or 10 or 12 feet down. Everything above that to the top of the bank is where our excess stormwater gets stored. It's our storage area. So wet bottom basins do have additional environmental benefits, and they can provide habitat for native wetland vegetation, as well as several other plant and animal species, and wet bottom basins also do a good job of improving stormwater quality, and so we can use them in areas that need improved stormwater quality. Both types of stormwater detention basins do function pretty much the same way to reduce flooding risks. They store excess stormwater, excess runoff. When we conduct our preliminary engineering reports or PERs, the recommendation for wet or dry detention basins depends really on a number of factors. There's a lot of variables that we look into, and it just depends on the specific site location. Example, in this spot, this Red Bluff detention basin is near Ellington Field, and so we coordinate with Houston Airport System on these detention basins because oftentimes wet bottom basins can attract birds and other wildlife that could pose a hazard to aircraft. And so that's why in this case, we'll be recommending a dry bottom basin.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is also for you. Jonathan, how big is the basin going to be?
Yeah, good question. We actually don't know yet. And so that's why we're conducting this preliminary engineering report, this PER, is to figure out exactly how big it needs to be. Gary talked through some of the steps that we went in for the feasibility study to determine why this area is the recommended area that needs to go forward. But in this preliminary engineering report, we're getting a little more detailed in determining, like you asked in your question, exactly how big the detention basin needs to be. And so if you'll remember, there is already an existing detention basin there today. And so we're looking at an expansion of that detention basin. And as we investigate how much bigger it needs to be, it really comes down to, well, how much is needed to mitigate those channel modifications that Gary talked about. And in the presentation, we talked through how the flood control district uses those two tools for flood risk reduction, one being channel modifications or increased channel conveyance, and then the second tool being the stormwater detention. And those two things work hand in hand, because as we modify channels and as we increase a channel's ability to convey more stormwater and convey more stormwater faster, we don't want to send excess flow downstream. We, as Gary mentioned, are a no impact agency. We can't adversely impact other areas. And so that's where the detention basin comes in. It mitigates for the increased flow that comes from the channel modifications. And so as we work through this PER, our engineering consultants are doing all of the hydrologic and hydraulic calculations to figure out how much we would increase flow with the channel, and then exactly how much extra detention is needed, and that'll answer the question for how big will the detention basin be.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, you mentioned that one of the flooding problems in this area is off-site flow from adjacent sub-areas. What does this mean? What does this mean?
Yes, when we talked about it in the presentation, that we identified, I believe, 3 different components of why portions of the Armandbody watershed flood. What this particular component is talking about when we talk about off-site sheet flow is that Harris County is very flat and its watersheds are relatively shallow. So when we get certain rain events that exceed the capacity of either the roadside ditches or neighborhood storm sewers or the bayous themselves, when we get a certain amount of rain in any particular area, once the capacity of the systems that are trying to collect the water and move it to the bayous get overwhelmed, then water has a tendency to follow old topographic directions. So if you go back and look at the topography of the watershed before anyone moved into this area, what you typically find is when you get these larger events, water is going to want to follow the old contours and make its way from high ground to low ground. And so specifically when we talk about offsite flow from adjacent subareas, what we're talking about is that's the excess water that cannot be collected properly within whatever storm sewer, roadside ditches, or bayous exist. And so as that water can't get into the bayous, it's just going to follow its own sheet flow paths and work its way from high ground to low ground. And so oftentimes we use the word sheet flow to mean that that's the water that just runs overland and makes its way and eventually gets. So if a neighborhood is downstream of a large sheet flow path, then what's going to happen is when it rains, that water after a period of time will travel overland and just work its way through the neighborhood. So these type of projects that we look at specifically when we're doing feasibility is we're trying to identify what are all the different reasons these areas flood, so that then we can start testing to say, okay, what would happen if we built a new channel here, or we upsize this existing roadside ditch and or storm sewer system. But because we talked about in the presentation, we're a no impact community. What that means is every time we do a project, we have to ensure that we're not moving water from one place to another and causing flooding. And that's typically why we do the detention basin facilities that go hand in hand with any of our infrastructure. So again, offsite flow is just really all the water that's moving overland that's not able to be captured somehow. And that water has to be managed when we do our watershed studies.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, what environmental conditions or issues will be investigated as part of the project?
Oh, yeah, good question. So any flood control project or any typical flood control project will usually entail four major components of an environmental investigation. First is the environmental site assessment, where the environmental consultant would physically go out to the site to look for any contaminants or look for any possible history of land use that would cause contamination in the area. So that's the environmental site assessment. There's a threatened and endangered species investigation. There's a cultural resource investigation. And then maybe what we mainly talk about in these instances, when we talk about environmental impacts or investigations, is the wetlands and what we would call a wetland delineation, where again, our environmental consultant physically goes out to the site and looks for different signs that would indicate what could be classified as a wetland. And there's several different types of wetlands, and that gets really in the weeds, pun not intended, to what these folks look into in environmental investigations. But the two main categories of those wetlands that we look into are sort of might be called like overland wetlands, but also they're stream wetlands. And so that gets into one of the main things that we're looking at in this project is the streams that are a part of the project, both tributary B500-04-00-E004, which is a man-made channel, and then also, of course, Bayou, which is a natural channel. And so we do those investigations to determine if those channels would be what we would classify as jurisdictional or under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that if you impact those channels, then you're subject to lots and lots of permitting requirements. And so that's some of the detail of what we go through and what we're really interested in this project, especially when we talk about channel or tributary B115 and making modifications to it. If it's determined that the channel bottom itself is, again, I'll use that word, jurisdictional, if that's determined, then we could have some extra cost and extra time that would be a part of the project in order to obtain the necessary permits to impact that channel bottom. Now, there's several different tools and ways that we can avoid those impacts, which we do often. Many flood control projects, we go out and we go through to incur those costs and add that time to the project. So what can we do? What are
All right, sorry, we're having some technical difficulties at the moment. Gary, would you like to go ahead and take off where Jonathan left off?
Yeah, can you remind me of the question?
Yes, absolutely. So what environmental conditions or issues will be investigated as part of the project?
Yeah, I'll just kind of give a sort of a recap because Jonathan gave pretty detailed answer, but basically what's happening as we transition from feasibility to the PER, when we started at feasibility level, we're going to look at really high level environmental, pretty obvious things such as, are there wetlands at a proposed site, or if we reconstruct the channel, is it jurisdictional, so that we can incorporate into our alternatives considerations on what the environmental factors and costs would be to mitigate the project, but also what the project would do to the physical environment that we're working in. As the project moves into the PER, they begin to do a lot more specific details. We kind of narrow down the field of what the project would look like. And then when they do their alternatives in the PER phase, they're more looking at, okay, we know that we're going to be doing something at this detention facility, so let's look at what could be done, such as we talked about it in the presentation, deepening, widening. So as they look at different alternatives in the PER, then they're going to go into very specific details about, okay, if we added this little section of land over here, are there environmental considerations, and what would that cost, so that they build that into their alternatives. And then there's generally public involvement, there's reviews, that sort of thing. And so the ultimate ending of all that process is hopefully an alternative that is the best alternative to achieve what we started out on the feasibility side of saying, here's what our project goals are. And they then basically go through that process, identify, the environmental issues and figure out the mitigation. They refine the costs. And then ultimately that project, if approved, would continue to move through the project life cycle.
All right. Thank you, Gary. I just want to say we have received a few questions about other projects, and wanted to let you know that while we are focusing on the Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin project tonight, we will answer all questions regarding other projects in writing after the meeting. All right, moving on to our next question. This next question is for Gary. Gary, will this project eliminate flooding in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. But the answer is it's impossible for us to say or guarantee that any one project will completely eliminate flooding in an area. So basically, when we do these projects, we're trying to reduce the flood risk, and we're trying to study the area, figure out what the flooding problems are. But as we saw with Tropical Storm Harvey, there's always potential that a much bigger rain event will come along than one we ever planned for. And that's where the risk comes in. So, a project that we do, we know it's going to reduce the flood risk in the area, but we can't guarantee that, now everything is going to be fixed. And add to that is that, we are doing a project that is going to affect specific infrastructure, but if things don't get maintained in the future, or, things happen within the collection system, there's always potential that there could be still some flood risk. So the flood control district, for the reason that we can't guarantee that there's not going to be a flood risk, we recommend that everyone in Harris County and the surrounding areas, if they can afford it, that they look into flood insurance, because that's really the best way to ensure against the possibility of personal and financial loss that comes with the possibility of future floods. Additionally, if you visit www.hcfcd.org/mapnext, which is MAAPNEXT, you can learn about the Flood Control District's MapNext initiative, which aims to produce Harris County's most comprehensive and complete set of flood hazard maps and information. And so in addition to these maps showing 100-year floodplains and regulatory floodplains. It's also going to have information about different flood hazards. And so collectively, those maps are really going to be able to help identify what risks are out there within different parts of the county. And we recommend that you look at them because, again, as I stated before, we can't guarantee that an area will never flood again once a project's in place. All we can say is that the project will provide flood reduction benefits. It will protect homes from the designs and the storm events that we look at. But a tropical storm, hurricane comes in and it exceeds that rainfall capacity, or it exceeds the amount of time that rain occurs during, and there's still going to be some residual flood risk in those areas.
Thank you, Gary. I just wanted to remind everyone that there are 3 ways to submit a comment about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box near the presentation live stream. You can submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/redbluff, or you can submit a comment via phone at 855-925-2801, utilizing meeting code 4679. If you are joining us via phone tonight, please press star to leave a message. And also, I would like to reiterate that any questions not addressed during tonight's Q&A will receive a response from the Flood Control District following the close of the comment period. All right, moving on to our next question. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, how can I find out if my home will benefit from this project? And can you tell us which streets will benefit?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we're not quite there yet. Remember a little earlier, we talked about where we are in this project life cycle, and we're at the very beginning of this PER, or preliminary engineering stage. And so these are the things that our engineers are looking to find out. Is we talked a little bit earlier about the size of the detention basin, right? We don't have that final recommendation yet because they're still doing the work to figure that out. And so once we know how big that detention basin can be or is going to be, and what the channel modifications will look like, then we'll be able to produce and publish the benefits of the project. And it's at the end of this preliminary engineering stage, or perhaps beginning of the next stage, which is the final design stage, that we'll come back to the community, back to y'all with another one of these public meetings, and we'll be able to share those results. So we're not quite there yet to be able to tell you if your street is going to be affected. But stay tuned and we'll share all that information with you once we have it.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, will there be trails around this basin property or other recreational features? Gary, you're muted.
Sorry about that. To answer the question, I'm going to give you the general, and then I'll kind of be more specific about this particular project. So in general, the Flood Control District does not build or maintain recreation or public amenities. But as part of our mission, we do share our property with agencies that wish to do so, as long as those amenities are compatible with the property's primary flood risk reduction purpose. So what this basically means is that we, as part of our enabling legislation, do not build or maintain recreational or public amenities, but we also recognize that as we acquire public land to do flood damage reduction projects, as we acquire right-of-way and build detention facilities, our detention facilities may only function during rain events, and it may only be 2-3 weeks out of the year that our facilities are full of water. So there's a recognition that, these are public facilities, they're paid for with taxpayer money, and that we want to make sure that they provide the greatest benefit. And given that, for every project we do, we typically, once we get past feasibility and we lay out conceptually what we're trying to do, as the project moves into more specifics, going through the PER process and then ultimately final design, those are the times where we start to coordinate with other entities to look at the likelihood and possibility of building trails along our infrastructure, trails around our basins. Sometimes, putting in and grading our basins so that ball fields or other amenities can be put in the bottom of those basins. And so we can't guarantee what's going to come out of this PER process, but we can guarantee that we will be working with other entities to identify needs for multi-use type facilities, and then doing our best to see if we can fit those facilities into what we have designed. But all that, it's important to consider that certain amenities can potentially reduce the amount of stormwater detention volume in a basin. So we have to balance, the needs of the community for multi-use also with the needs of what we're trying to build for a flood damage reduction project.
Thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, how is this project being funded, and how much will it cost to construct?
Yep. So right now in the preliminary engineering stage is being funded through the 2018 bond program, and that is bond ID F99. The total number on that bond ID F99 is $10 million. And so we're using some of that 10 million to fund the study, as well as the next stage, which would be final design. And then the rest of that money would be used for the construction stage of the project. We don't have a construction cost estimate yet. That will depend on the recommended alternative that comes out of the PER. So that's another one that goes in the category of stay tuned to the next presentation that we have on this project. But also note that the Flood Control District continually pursues partnership funding for most of its projects. And so we continue to look for grants and other funding partnerships when and where needed.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our next question is for Gary. Gary, wouldn't it be better to expand the channel first?
Yeah, that question, we touched on that during the presentation, specifically that the project that we're recommending that came out of the feasibility study was a combination of channel conveyance improvements, basically upsizing the carrying capacity of the B115 channel. But if we were to do that without first building detention, we would run the risk that the project, in moving more water into Armandbody, if the bayou doesn't have a way to convey that water safely out of Armandbody, we would potentially see impacts. And those impacts would translate as more flow in the bayou and therefore higher water elevations and possibly structural flooding, where structural flooding didn't occur before. So because we do not allow those type of projects where we're just moving water from one area to another, and it allowing for an impact, we basically have to analyze, when we do these projects, we have to analyze, okay, if we improve the conveyance in this area, how do we mitigate that water? How do we safely store it or convey it out all the way out? So typically our first and foremost, we would love to be able to say, let's just channelize everything all the way out to the outlet of Armandbody. But what happens there is the costs of that project start to substantially increase. So in the case of this particular project, we looked at the B115 channel and we analyzed what do we need to do to be able to hit the target flood damage reduction goals that we had. And then we went in and said, okay, once we do that, what would be the impact to Armandbody? And then our engineers go in and say, okay, if that's the impact, what do we need to do to make sure that that impact is reduced down to zero impact? And that's where the detention facility comes in. And so the reason we're doing the detention first is to make sure that the capacity is there so that there would be no downstream impacts, so that once that's in place, we can go back. It would be great if we could do it in the other order, because most of the benefits come from the channel improvement portion of it, the channel conveyance improvements. But again, by policy, we can't do that first. We have to put in place the steps to make sure that the project will not create any moving floods or downstream impacts. And that's why we will be doing the detention facility first.
All right, thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, when will you be able to share more project specifics?
Yep, we'll be able to get you more of those specifics as this preliminary engineering stage comes to its conclusion. The PER is anticipated to be complete in the spring of 2023. Before the PER is finalized and transmitted to Harris County Commissioners Court, we will have another community engagement meeting just like this one. And so at that time, we'll have identified the alternatives to meet the flood damage reduction goals. We'll have selected one of those alternatives and we'll be able to share that with the community. Robert, you're still muted.
Thank you, Jonathan. So our next question is for Gary. Gary, can you explain why this project was recommended over other projects in the watershed?
Yeah, how this one particularly was recommended has a lot to do with the process we went through. So when we did our Armandbody watershed study, we knew in the 2018 bond, we had a certain amount of budget to be able to implement projects. And so we went through a process during the feasibility study of saying, let's study the entire watershed. Let's identify where we're seeing historical flooding or where our models and data that we use predict there would be historical flooding, to make sure that we could then identify what at the time we were calling them problem areas or areas of interest. But basically what that means is we were trying to identify where do we see problems. And then from there, we went in and said, okay, let's identify the worst of these areas so that we can then do feasibility studies to look at, okay, what could we do? So as we started studying a handful of those 39 problem areas that we talked about in the presentation, we ended up with, I don't remember specifically, but 5 or 6 problem areas. And then we went in and said, okay, let's identify what projects could we do. And as we identified those projects fully, we were able to then do high-level cost estimates and look at environmental impacts to say, okay, some of these projects, because of the impacts and because of the costs, it could be, these are going to take a much longer time frame to be able to implement. And so as we started to identify projects, Commissioners Court has adopted a prioritization framework, and that prioritization framework gives us tools on how we can score metrics. You know, what are the benefits of the project? What are the costs of the project? I believe there's 9 or 10 different categories. And so we were sort of moving towards, we have multiple options to do at the feasibility level. We were scoring them, and then we were trying to make recommendations on where do we see the worst of the flooding, where can we identify projects that the 2018 bond would allow us with current funding to be able to go in and start a project. And so as we went through all of that, and a lot of this is documented in the feasibility study, we ultimately recommended a handful of projects. This was, I believe, the highest scoring project that came out of the study, but other projects in the area have also advanced towards the PER process. So, and that's a very similar process we used on all of our watershed studies countywide.
All right, thank you, Gary. Our next question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, how long will it take to construct this project, and when will it start?
So still not sure yet on the construction time, but as far as when construction could start, still probably a little too far out to get really close on that. But we talked about the PER concluding in the spring of 2023, and then design stage, which is the next stage in the project life cycle, typically last about 9 to 12 months, and those 12 months can include the bid phase. And so we would probably be looking at starting construction sometime in 2024.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. Our last question of the evening is for Gary. Gary, there is already a stormwater detention basin at this location. What do you mean by optimization?
Yeah, that's a great question. We touched on a lot of the elements in the presentation, but what we're basically talking about when we say the word optimization is that in the previous discussions as well as the presentation, we talked about that this project is kind of two different components. One component is stormwater conveyance improvements on the B115 channel. So when we do that, we are collecting more runoff and sending that runoff towards Armandbody. Well, when we were doing the feasibility study, the B500-04 or Red Bluff Stormwater Detention Basin happens to be right next to where we were trying to send this additional flow. So when we say the word optimization, what we're talking about is we want to look at this current existing basin and then see how, based on our feasibility study, all these numbers will be updated, but in the feasibility study, we had a target amount of volume that we said, if we do the B115 improvements, we're going to need a certain amount of volume to be added on top of what was already in this basin. And so we identified a conceptual way of doing that at the feasibility level, but as it moves into the PER phase, they're going to go into more design specifics to look at, okay, how do we get that volume? They will verify the volume within their own analysis, but then they'll have to look at how do we add that volume. And there's many ways of doing that. There may be deepening the bottom of the basin a little bit, or adjusting some of the side slopes, or acquiring some additional land around the basin. So that's what they're going to end up doing, is looking at that full process of saying, how can we add this volume on top of what's in the current basin so that the project can be constructed? And we're just using that word optimization as, you know, just making adjustments to this existing basin to allow for this project to be able to be constructed.
All right, thank you, Gary. And with that, I'd like to share one final reminder that the comment period associated with this meeting runs through October 12th, but we're always looking for your input and engagement. We also encourage everyone to get flood insurance, as flood season in Harris County runs year-round. Thank you again for joining us this evening and for providing your input on this project. We look forward to continuing to share updates as our work moves forward. Stay safe and have a good evening.